At 30,000 feet, a father demanded Big Shaq's mom give up her seat for his child. What he thought was a simple ask turned into a moment that shook the entire cabin. The flight attendant didn't just reply, she delivered a reckoning. Passengers went silent. One woman stayed seated, and the balance of power quietly shifted. Because this wasn't about comfort, it was about who's been asked to move their whole lives. And this time, dignity didn't get up. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It was one of those almost too perfect mornings in Miami. Sun high, breeze light. The kind of day where the world feels just balanced enough to trick you into thinking peace is promised. Lucille O'Neal, dressed in tailored cream slacks, a navy silk blouse, and soft pearl earrings, walked through gate A17 with the calm of a woman who had fought too many wars to fear airports. Her stride was dignified but unhurried. She clutched a slim leather handbag and her boarding pass, eyes scanning the wide-bodied jet she was about to enter. First-class seat, 3A. Aisle quiet. Perfect. She offered a warm nod to the attendant scanning her ticket, receiving a soft welcome aboard, ma'am, in return. There was no red carpet, but Lucille carried her own. Not because she demanded special treatment, but because she'd learned long ago that moving through the world as a black woman, with grace, was a silent protest of its own. Her late husband used to call it her superpower. She called it survival. Lucille stepped into the cabin, the cool interior air wrapping around her like a gentle welcome. She smiled briefly at the row of seats, placed her bag in the overhead compartment, and eased into. She folded her hands over her lap, exhaled once, and prepared herself for what she assumed would be a smooth, uneventful flight to New York. But peace has a way of attracting disturbance. Roughly 15 minutes later, the cabin's gentle quiet was interrupted by a short burst of frustration at the gate. Gate agents fumbled papers, a child whined, and then, rising above the mild chaos, a voice cut through. Deep, sharp, impatient. I have a 7-year-old. I shouldn't have to explain this. We asked for seats together. Lucille's posture didn't shift. She had heard that tone before, decorated with forced courtesy, but soaked in entitlement. It was the tone of a man who didn't like being told no. Moments later, Clark Danner walked into the cabin with his daughter, Eloise. Clark was in his late 30s, broad-shouldered, and expensively dressed. White polo, leather satchel, mirrored sunglasses on his collar. He looked like the kind of man who made decisions over speakerphones and expected follow-through without question. His daughter, fair-haired with an oversized stuffed unicorn under one arm, followed close behind. They paused just past row 2. Clark's eyes landed on Lucille. Seat 3. His expression flickered, subtle, but unmistakable. A tight, surprised pause, then a smile practiced and insincere. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, gesturing to the empty window seat beside Lucille. "Would you mind? Actually, my daughter and I were supposed to sit together. That's her seat. Is it okay if we switch?" Lucille turned slowly. She met his gaze with one that had raised 4 children, battled 2 forms of discrimination, and buried a husband without shedding a public tear. "My ticket says 3A, she said, her voice smooth as a violin note. "And that seat is 3B. I believe that's your daughter's." Clark blinked, recalculating. "Right. I know. It's just, I figured she'd be more comfortable with me right next to her. You know how kids are." Lucille tilted her head slightly. "Mine turned out just fine." The man chuckled awkwardly. "Of course. I just thought, she's not great with strangers. And this seat's closer to the aisle, might be easier for you anyway." Lucille didn't answer. She looked forward, folding her hands again. A few passengers looked up from their phones, pretending not to listen. One woman across the aisle lowered her sunglasses. A businessman 2 rows back watched without blinking. The tension had the flavor of theater, the kind where nobody wants to admit they're in the audience. Eloise shifted nervously, squeezing her unicorn. "Daddy, I want the window seat," she whispered. Clark crouched slightly. "We'll get it, sweetie. Just hang tight." He stood again, his voice coated now in a falsely sweet veneer. "Look, ma'am, I know we're all trying to get settled, and I really don't want to make this a thing. She's just a kid. I'm just asking if you could maybe be understanding." Lucille turned to him again. "And I'm asking you to respect my seat." The sentence didn't rise in volume, but it landed heavy. Clark sighed and looked around, seeking validation. The passengers responded with stillness. Nobody moved to back him up. Nobody spoke. That's the thing about these moments. They often hang in the air like an open wound. No one wants to touch it. But everyone smells the blood. Clark's expression hardened. You don't have to be difficult. I'm just trying to make my child comfortable. Lucille didn't flinch. And I'm trying to travel in peace. Same flight. Same sky. The child, now visibly uncomfortable, sat quietly on the armrest of the seat, clutching her unicorn like a lifeline. From the galley behind them, a woman's voice called. Everything okay up here? Rena Caldwell entered the cabin. Mid-40s, tall, with coiled hair pulled into a precise bun. Her uniform crisp. Her tone unreadable. Clark straightened. We have a little seating issue. My daughter was supposed to be next to me, but he gestured vaguely at Lucille, as if she were a misplaced item. Rena looked at Lucille, then at the boarding manifest in her hand. Her eyes scanned. Sir, you and your daughter are in seats 3B and 3C. This passenger is in 3A. Everyone is in their correct seat. I get that, Clark said. I'm just saying, it would be nice if... It's not a request we can enforce, Rena interrupted. If she chooses to move, that's her decision. Otherwise, we proceed as assigned. Lucille offered Rena a soft smile. Rena nodded once in return. Clark, now visibly frustrated, turned to his daughter. Sit down, Eloise. As the child climbed into the middle seat, her legs dangling above the floor, Clark settled into 3C with a sigh. He didn't look at Lucille again. Meanwhile, outside the aircraft, Shaquille O'Neal stood quietly at the gate, in no rush, a delayed VIP boarding pass in his hand. A man that size doesn't enter unnoticed, but sometimes he waits to be seen. From his spot near the gate, he'd seen it all unfold through the window, and though the passengers on board didn't know it yet, the flight had just begun to write a story much heavier than miles. Because sometimes a seat on a plane is more than just a number. Sometimes it's a front row ticket to what people still believe about who belongs where. And as the engines began their gentle whir, and the boarding doors closed behind them, the cabin had already become something more than pressurized air and assigned seats. It had become a reflection of every silent judgment, every unspoken rule, and every person who's ever been told to move, not because they were in the wrong, but because they were in the way. Clark Dannard didn't need to raise his voice. That was never his way. His authority came baked into every word, coated in a kind of manufactured civility that made it easier to disguise the roots of his entitlement. He leaned slightly forward in his seat, arms resting on the armrests like a king on his throne, the seatbelt still unbuckled as the cabin slowly filled with murmuring passengers and polite chaos. Lucille O'Neal, unbothered, sat with her back straight, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady on the headrest in front of her. Her body didn't shift. Her hands rested like granite in her lap. I really don't think it's that big of a deal, Clark said, voice calm, but each syllable sharpened like a tool. I'm just asking for a little flexibility. She's a child. 7. She gets anxious when I'm not near her. His tone was sweet, almost performative. The kind used by men who are used to getting what they want, without needing to ask twice. Lucille didn't answer. Across the aisle, a man with glasses lowered his newspaper just an inch. 2 rows up, a woman wearing a tan cardigan exchanged a glance with her husband. The energy in the cabin had changed, imperceptibly at first, but now it had a distinct edge, like the tension of a string pulled too tight on a bow. Clark gave a small, almost theatrical laugh. Look, I get it. We all paid for our seats. But Con, she's sitting between strangers. I just think maybe, we could work something out. He used the word we, but he didn't mean both of them. He meant her. He was waiting for Lucille to make herself smaller, more accommodating, more comfortable for the room. Still, she didn't move. Her silence was not passive. It was deliberate. Eloise shifted beside her, fidgeting. Daddy, I want to sit by the window, she said, tugging his sleeve. I don't like it here. I know, sweetie, he murmured, his eyes never leaving Lucille. I'm trying. He turned back to her with that same fixed smile. Ma'am, I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just thinking of her. It's just a seat. That line hovered in the air like smoke. Just a seat. That phrase, so harmless to him, carried centuries of weight for Lucille. Just a seat had once meant the back of the bus. Just a seat had meant waiting until all the white customers had been served. Just a seat had been 100,000 quiet humiliations, from lunch counters to courtrooms. The irony, of course, was that to Clark, this wasn't about history. It was about his comfort, his control. Lucille finally turned her head, met his eyes, "And I'm just sitting in it," she replied. Then turned forward again. Her words were quiet, but they landed with more impact than any shout. Clark leaned back slightly, exhaled, then smirked like he was the only adult in the room. He looked toward the front of the cabin. Rena Caldwell, the flight attendant, stood watching, arms behind her back, face unreadable. She hadn't moved a step closer. Not yet. The hush in the cabin grew heavier. Behind them, a voice whispered from row 5. A woman, mid-40s, spoke to her partner in a tone she thought was hushed. "Why doesn't she just move? It's not like it's personal." But of course it was personal. It had always been personal. Clark glanced down at his daughter. "You okay, honey?" "I want to sit with you," Eloise mumbled, her voice rising, a touch of whining now in her tone. He raised his voice slightly. Not enough to sound aggressive, but enough to pull in more ears. "She's uncomfortable, ma'am. You can understand that, right?" Lucille didn't reply. His jaw twitched. "It's not like I'm asking for something crazy. I mean, she's a grandmother, for God's sake. What difference does it make to her?" The words were low, almost muttered, but loud enough. Lucille turned again. Her tone this time carried ice, even though her volume remained soft. "Being older doesn't mean I'm invisible. And it doesn't mean I owe you my place." The rows behind them stiffened. One woman dropped her phone in her lap. A man to the left shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't loud, this moment, but it was seismic. Still, Clark pressed on. That was his kind, men who didn't know when they were out of bounds because they were too used to being allowed in. "I'm not trying to cause a scene," he said with a light chuckle that masked rising irritation. "I just think some people forget how to be decent." Lucille looked forward, not giving him the satisfaction of another glance. Eloise's voice pitched again. "I don't like it, Daddy." Rena finally stepped forward, gently but firmly, her polished shoes quiet on the carpet. She looked at Clark, her expression professional but tight. "Is there a concern with your seat, sir?" He gestured vaguely. "I just thought, for the sake of my daughter's comfort, this passenger could swap." Rena didn't even glance at Lucille. Her voice held weight now. "All passengers are in their assigned seats. We do not reassign based on preference." Clark laughed again, louder this time. "It's not preference, it's common courtesy. I mean, this is a kid." "And that," Rena said, "is an adult woman. One who has every right to remain where she is." Silence, heavy and thick. Clark's face changed for the first time, not anger yet, but disbelief, like the world had turned sideways and refused to cooperate. He opened his mouth, but Rena held up a hand. "If there's no safety concern, I'm going to ask you to respect the seating chart and allow us to continue boarding." Clark sat back hard against the seat. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "She's making this more difficult than it needs to be." Lucille didn't flinch. Eloise pouted in the middle seat, folding her arms. The unicorn drooped in her lap. The father reached over and buckled her belt, with more force than necessary. He looked out the window now, jaw clenched, steam behind his eyes. Passengers whispered again. But the energy was shifting, faint, like a tide turning. Lucille closed her eyes for a moment. Breathed. Not to calm herself, but to remain herself. Because in moments like this, it wasn't about being loud. It was about being unmovable. Rena stood firm beside them, not backing down. Lucille nodded slightly at her, a gesture of quiet solidarity. And though no announcement had been made, no turbulence declared, the flight had already encountered its first storm. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing in a quiet cabin isn't the weather. It's a man who thinks kindness looks like obedience, and doesn't know the difference. When Rena Caldwell finally moved from her station near the galley, it was with the grace of someone trained to handle turbulence before the plane ever left the ground. Her stride was poised, calm, but purposeful. Every passenger who'd been watching from the corner of their eye now turned openly. The air in the cabin grew tense, charged with expectation. Many assumed she was going to ask Lucille to move. After all, wasn't that what happened in situations like this? The quiet older woman usually yielded, not because she was wrong, but because it was easier. But Rena didn't stop in front of Lucille. She stepped directly into Clark Danner's row and faced him, her posture formal, her expression still neutral but carrying a different kind of authority now. She didn't lean in to whisper. She didn't crouch to meet him at eye level like he was a confused customer. She stood straight, level, and spoke clearly enough for the adjacent rows to hear. "Sir, I understand your concern," she said, voice smooth but deliberate. "But as stated, All passengers are seated correctly according to their boarding passes. No one is obligated to move. Clark blinked, caught off guard. His brow furrowed as though the math suddenly didn't add up. Right, but I'm just trying to get her to see reason, he said, tilting his head toward Lucille. It's not about the ticket, it's just a little humanity. Rena tilted her head ever so slightly. Humanity works both ways. Clark sat back, clearly thrown. He wasn't used to pushback that didn't come with a badge or a headline. You're siding with her? Really? I'm not siding with anyone, Rena said firmly. I'm enforcing policy. This passenger, she motioned gently toward Lucille, has been respectful, seated, and in the correct place since boarding. The same cannot be said for the disruption occurring now. A flicker of disbelief crossed Clark's face. The narrative he'd rehearsed in his head, about being the polite parent unfairly ignored, was slipping through his fingers. His hand dropped from Eloise's shoulder, and for the first time, his voice carried just the hint of sharpness beneath the calm. I'm not trying to cause a scene. You're not, Rena replied, but continuing to pressure another passenger could escalate this unnecessarily. I'm asking you to let it go. The tone of her last 3 words carried an unmistakable finality, the way you might speak to a fire you know will catch if you let it breathe. Behind them, in 4A, Shawnee Henderson sat upright now. She had been quiet until now, headphones off, sunglasses lowered. She observed everything with an expression that said she'd seen this dance before. Her eyes narrowed at Clark, then flicked briefly to Lucille. The stillness of Lucille's body, the way she hadn't flinched, hadn't shrunk, said more than words ever could. Shawnee recognized it. The kind of strength that doesn't advertise itself, but refuses to retreat. Clark looked around as if seeking a lifeline. He searched the faces of other passengers, hoping one of them would speak up in agreement, maybe echo his complaint with a knowing nod. But the audience had changed. The theater of sympathy had gone quiet. Someone behind them coughed. A woman on the aisle looked down at her hands. The businessman 2 rows forward kept scrolling through emails, pretending not to care. But everyone was listening. Eloise fidgeted. Daddy, can I just sit by the window next time? We'll figure it out later, Clark said, jaw clenched. Lucille remained still, her eyes forward. Not defiant, just present, fully, unshakably present. She had learned long ago that silence could be its own language, especially in rooms where you were never expected to speak first. Rena stepped back once, giving Clark one more look. Something behind her eyes that felt like both a warning and an offer. Then she turned, walked down the aisle with professional calm, and returned to the front cabin. Not rushed, not apologetic, just done. But the moment wasn't. Clark exhaled, low and bitter. This is insane, he muttered under his breath. All I wanted was to sit with my daughter. The man across the aisle finally spoke, softly but clearly. No, you wanted her to move so you could be more comfortable. Clark's head jerked slightly. Excuse me? The man didn't engage further, just turned toward the window. The conversation closed. That one sentence had cracked through Clark's illusion, exposing its foundation. He shifted in his seat, crossed his arms, tried to settle, but the weight in the cabin had changed again. This time, it had settled on him. Shawnee leaned closer toward the window, not enough to be obvious, but enough to catch a glimpse of Lucille's profile. Her respect for the older woman deepened by the second. She could see what the others couldn't. How much it took to remain seated with dignity while the world asked you to stand, apologize, or vanish. In that moment, it wasn't just a flight. It was a courtroom, a church pew, a bus stop, a waiting room. Every space where people like Lucille had been expected to yield. Shawnee reached into her purse, pulled out a notepad, and scribbled something, a name, a number. She folded it neatly. Not yet, she thought. But later this might matter. Eloise was now quiet, head resting on the unicorn. Small legs pulled up into the seat. The tantrum had ended before it began, overtaken by the tension even a child could sense. Clark shifted again, uncomfortably. His phone buzzed once. He ignored it. Time ticked on. The final passengers boarded. The door hissed shut. In the cockpit, the co-pilot went through pre-flight checks. In the cabin, Rena reappeared, moving down the aisle to ensure compliance. She didn't look toward Clark or Lucille. She didn't have to. Her stance had been made clear. Lucille exhaled once, slow and steady. Not relief, not victory, Just breath. A reclaiming of space. Shawnee watched her. From behind her sunglasses, her expression softened. She thought of Manara, her daughter, and what kind of women she might grow up to be. She hoped it would be one like Lucille. The aircraft engines rumbled beneath them, signaling the beginning of the taxi toward the runway. But for many on board, the journey had already begun. Not through the air, but through a reckoning. One they didn't book. One they couldn't avoid. Because sometimes the person walking down the aisle isn't coming to remove you. They're coming to remind someone else. Not everything in this world bends for your comfort. And sometimes, the most powerful move is standing still. The cabin door opened one last time with a soft mechanical hiss. Final boarding. No fanfare. No announcement. Just the quiet expectation that whatever was unsettled would now settle. But instead, a shadow stretched across the threshold of first class, and every whispered breath inside the cabin seemed to pause. He didn't stride in like a celebrity. He didn't flash a grin or call attention to himself. But the moment Shaquille O'Neal stepped into the aisle, all conversation slowed to silence. It wasn't just his size, though that alone was enough to make people stare. It was his presence, a mountain of a man, with quiet gravity, dressed simply in a soft charcoal hoodie and gray slacks, travel duffel over one shoulder. No entourage, no sunglasses, just Shaq. A man used to being seen, and now walking into a space that had already drawn invisible battle lines. Row 3 was his target. That much was clear. But he didn't rush. He walked with that slow, even rhythm of someone who carried time, not chased it. Eyes flicked toward him from every direction, some in awe, some in shock, a few in slow recognition. Heads turned like dominoes. Even the captain poked his head from the cockpit before retreating again without a word. Clark Danner's jaw tightened the moment he looked up and locked eyes with the approaching figure. There was a beat of delay, like his mind was slow to process what his eyes already knew. Then a twitch of realization. Then panic, not outward, but a subtle kind. The kind of internal scramble that happens when you realize you've just stepped into something far bigger than you thought. Lucille, still seated in 3A, did not turn. She hadn't flinched since Shaq's arrival. If she noticed the whispering ripple now passing through the rows behind her, she didn't show it. Her eyes remained fixed on the safety card in the seat pocket ahead, her lips a soft, unreadable line. Shawnee, sitting quietly in 4A, saw her husband long before anyone else reacted. She smiled faintly to herself but didn't move. She knew his pace, his silence, his restraint. She also knew what had likely played out while he waited to board. He never rushed unless there was real trouble, which meant that by the time Shaq stepped through that cabin door, he'd already read the room. Shaq reached the row and paused. His eyes moved first to his mother, then to the child, quiet now, tucked into the middle seat, then to Clark, who straightened slightly as if to reclaim control of the moment. "Oh," Clark said too quickly, too brightly. "Hey, wow, didn't even see you there. You're Shaq, right?" He laughed nervously, running a hand through his hair. "Man, didn't recognize her. I mean, I didn't realize she was you. I wasn't trying to look. It's been a weird boarding process." Shaq didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply blinked slowly, letting the man's words hang in the air with nowhere to land. He looked down at Clark, as if considering something he wasn't ready to say yet. Clark stumbled forward with words, voice a little too eager. "No harm meant, of course. Just a seating thing. Totally understand now. I'm a huge fan, by the way." Still, Shaq remained silent. That silence was louder than any confrontation. The way he stood, not blocking, not accusing, just being exposed Clark in a way that no argument could. The truth had already played out before the cameras were metaphorical, and now standing in the aisle, like a verdict that had just arrived, was the man whose mother had been asked to surrender her space, not because of a mistake, but because of an assumption. Clark tried to chuckle again. "Guess I picked the wrong grandma to bother. Huh." Lucille finally turned her head. Just slightly. Just enough to look Clark dead in the eyes. "She was the right one," she said evenly. "You were just the wrong man." That landed. Shawnee exhaled quietly. Even the air conditioning seemed to hush in response. Shaq finally moved. Not toward Clark but toward his seat. He placed his duffel in the overhead compartment, adjusted the strap once, then lowered himself slowly into 3C, the aisle seat next to his mother. His knees nearly brushed the seat in front of him, but he folded in with practiced ease. Clark shifted in his own seat, now pressed uncomfortably between Shaq and his daughter. The cabin had grown still, the air thick with something more potent than discomfort. Recognition, not just of celebrity, but of something deeper. Legacy, of who Lucille was. Not just Shaq's mother, but a woman who had raised strength in silence, power and patience. Rena returned briefly to the aisle, scanning the rows, noting the new arrangement, but saying nothing. Her eyes passed over Shaq. Their gazes met for a fraction of a second, an acknowledgement. Then she disappeared again toward the cockpit, professional mask back in place. Clark reached over and adjusted Eloise's seatbelt, then leaned slightly toward Lucille. His voice lowered to a murmur now. Look, I think this all got blown out of proportion. If I'd known. I wasn't trying to disrespect you. Lucille turned her head fully now, her voice still calm, but sharpened just enough to cut. You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with respect. That's the part you still don't understand. Clark had no answer for that. None that mattered. Shaq placed a large hand gently over his mother's. A silent gesture. Reassuring, protective. But still, he didn't speak. Passengers slowly returned to their books, their screens, their phones. But not their comfort. Not entirely. The moment had etched itself into the space between them. A moment that didn't need headlines or recordings. The story had already been told in posture, in silence, in who was expected to move and who refused. The plane began to taxi. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the engine hummed louder beneath them. But the real power still rested in seat 3A. Because a giant had entered. But the strength had already been seated. It's not like that, Clark said, his voice awkwardly light, cracking just enough to betray him. I didn't know. If I'd known. But that was the problem, wasn't it? If he had known. If he'd recognized Lucille O'Neal as more than just a black woman in a premium seat. If he'd seen her before seeing what he assumed didn't belong, the damage was already done. And his apology, if you could call it that, hung limp in the stale air between them. Too thin to carry the weight of what had just happened. Shaq didn't respond. He hadn't spoken a single word since taking his seat beside his mother. But silence, when held by a man like that, had its own gravitational pull, the kind that turned eyes away and thoughts inward. Lucille remained facing forward, regal, unshaken. She hadn't replied to Clark's string of excuses, and she wouldn't. Not because she didn't have words, but because she'd spent decades offering explanations to men just like him. Men who'd ask a question not to understand, but to justify. Men who assumed kindness from her without offering dignity in return. Rena stood near the galley now, arms folded loosely, one foot braced slightly forward. Her uniform was still immaculate, her badge gleaming faintly in the cabin light, but her energy had changed. The earlier neutrality had drained from her stance, replaced by something steadier, resolve. She wasn't intervening this time because she didn't need to. Everyone knew what this was now. Everyone felt it. Clark tried to laugh again, the sound thin and misplaced. I swear this whole thing's gotten so touchy these days. I was just trying to do right by my daughter. That's all. No offense intended. You know how it is. Kids come first. Shawnee looked up from behind her sunglasses. Her expression stayed smooth, but a subtle shift in her brow betrayed what she was thinking. No, Clark. We don't know how it is. Not your version of it anyway. Clark reached for the air vent above his head, twisting it unnecessarily, fingers fidgeting now. His knee bounced. Eloise had settled down again, head resting on her unicorn, unaware, untouched by the tension that had rippled through the row like a fault line. Lucille blinked slowly, her eyes trailing up to the ceiling, and in that stillness the weight of memory surfaced, old, thick and sharp around the edges. A soda fountain in 1964. She'd been 15, standing in line behind a counter she wasn't supposed to approach. A white boy her age had stepped ahead of her, placed his order, and turned around laughing, calling her Miss Back of the Line. The man behind the counter had nodded like that was policy. Lucille had walked home thirsty that day, her pride held tighter than her fists. A public bus in 72. She had just left her nursing classes, books stacked in her lap. A white woman boarded with 2 children, and told her, "You're in my spot." Lucille had looked up, stood without speaking, and given it up, not because she believed she should, but because there were 2 children watching, and she refused to let them see hatred mirrored in her eyes. A college meeting in '85, after Shaq had started showing signs of greatness, one of the recruiters had asked, Does he have any discipline? Given the environment.
The environment.
He had said it like it was a disease she'd failed to contain. She'd smiled tightly, then walked out of the room before her tongue said something her spirit would regret. Lucille had spent her life being asked to move. Physically, emotionally, spiritually. Yield your space. Soften your tone. Be grateful to be near, even if never invited. And yet she had never been bitter. She had grown stronger, quieter, more commanding in her stillness. That was what made her dangerous now. She didn't ask. She didn't argue. She simply was, and that to men like Clark was the deepest threat of all. Back in the present, Clark was still rambling. I think people forget context. Like if it was just any other flight, any other person, I'd have reacted the same. Shawnee shifted slightly in her seat. Arms crossed now, eyebrows lifted, her eyes fixed on him. There was no need to speak. Her silence had its own edge. Rena approached again, her hands now clasped in front of her, voice firm. Sir, I need to ask you to refrain from speaking to the passengers around you, unless necessary. Clark blinked at her. I was just talking. I understand, Rena said. But at this point, continuing to address someone who is not engaging with you could be interpreted as harassment. Clark's lips parted like he might argue, but the word harassment was a line he didn't want on record. He nodded once, swallowed, and turned his face toward the window, jaw locked tight. Lucille turned her head slightly, not toward Clark, but toward Rena. Thank you, she said simply. Rena gave the briefest smile, one shared between women who understood how many miles could sit between a seat and the freedom to keep it. Shaq finally reached down to his armrest and lowered it gently between himself and Clark. Not a threat, not a gesture of force, just a declaration. This space is mine. It will not be shared. The plane began its slow roll toward the runway. The movement jarred some passengers back to normalcy. Magazines were lifted, phones unlocked, earbuds inserted, but no one forgot. Even with the engines humming, the real vibration remained in the rows of first class. In the still, silent power of a woman who had learned to carry the weight of truth in her spine. Because the thing about truth is, no matter how you try to laugh it off, or spin it smooth, it lingers. It hovers in the air long after excuses evaporate. And in that cabin, the truth had finally taken a seat no one could unsee. The aircraft sped forward, wheels pressing harder against the ground. But inside, Clark Danner was the only one feeling like he was falling. The aircraft was positioned for takeoff, engines humming with restrained energy. Passengers had fastened seatbelts, devices were stowed, and the routine hush before liftoff had settled over the cabin. But no one in the first few rows was thinking about altitude or airspeed. The real turbulence was still sitting between them, quiet, unresolved, and pressing down heavier than gravity. Shawnee rested her elbow lightly on the armrest, chin tilted as she gazed forward. Her eyes weren't on the back of the seat in front of her. They were reading the room, reading the faces. Rena was by the front galley again, posture straight, not fidgeting, not retreating, and Lucille sat like she always had, solid, calm, unmoved. Then, without fanfare or chime, the speakers overhead crackled softly. Ladies and gentlemen, came the captain's voice, measured and composed. This is Captain Roland Beach speaking. Welcome aboard. There was something in his tone, familiar, grounded, and distinctly human. Not the robotic monologue passengers had grown used to tuning out. This wasn't a voice reading off coordinates or cruising altitudes. This voice had presence, a weight behind the syllables. I'd like to take a moment before departure to thank you for your cooperation with our boarding process. We understand travel can bring its own stress and expectations, but here at Falcon Air we prioritize more than just destination. We prioritize decency. That word didn't hang. It landed. Clark shifted in his seat. Not dramatically, just a subtle, sharp twitch. Lucille, unbothered, remained focused on the invisible horizon outside her window. Rena didn't move a muscle. The captain's voice continued, steady as steel, wrapped in silk. I want to remind everyone, crew and passengers alike, that dignity and respect are non-negotiable on this aircraft. From the cockpit to the cabin, every seat, every row, deserves the same regard. No one on this flight should be asked to give up more than their luggage allowance. That line triggered a visible response. A woman in row 5 lowered her magazine. A man in business class leaned forward slightly. Eyes that had been pretending to rest were now wide open. Shawnee gave a faint smile. The captain wasn't calling names. He wasn't scolding. He was holding up a mirror. In our world, Captain Beach said, voice never raising, there are unspoken rules and louder silences. But up here, 30,000 feet above the earth, we aim to shed some of that weight. So as we taxi for takeoff, I'd ask all of us to reflect, not just on where we're going, but on who's beside us, and why that matters. The intercom clicked off with finality. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Clark didn't look up. His eyes were glued to the seat in front of him, shoulders tight. Eloise had drifted into a light doze, curled up with her unicorn, blissfully unaware that her father was unraveling in front of a cabin full of strangers. Shaq leaned back slowly, head tilted against the seat. He hadn't spoken once since boarding. He didn't need to. Sometimes presence alone was protest. Lucille allowed her lips to press into the faintest curve of a smile. It wasn't smugness. It wasn't victory. It was recognition, a nod to the rare but powerful moments when someone else said what she had spent her life showing, that she mattered, without caveats, without needing to prove it. Shawnee shifted in her seat and met Rena's eyes across the cabin. A subtle nod passed between them. Not applause, not triumph, just understanding, the kind that women often share across rooms where their dignity has been tested and found intact. Rena didn't smile, but her chin lifted just slightly, her spine already straight, now steeled by reinforcement. She turned and moved to the galley, beginning to prepare the drink carts like nothing had happened. But everyone knew something had. A man in 2A turned to his seatmate, whispering something they'd both clearly regretted saying earlier. A middle-aged woman in 4C closed her book and sighed quietly. Some people looked embarrassed. Some looked thoughtful. Some just looked away, unwilling to confront what had played out in plain sight. But it was too late for avoidance now. The message had been delivered, and not by a lecture, not by a scolding, not by rage. It had been carried by the voice of a white man in authority, who had nothing to prove, but everything to affirm, that it wasn't just one woman's fight to claim her space. It was everyone's duty to ensure she never had to. Clark sat stiffly, his fingers tapping his knee, unable to shake the feeling that somehow he had been placed on trial, and the verdict had been handed down in every passenger's silence. Because the truth wasn't subtle anymore. It had been etched into every interaction since boarding, and now, it had been broadcast over the speakers too clear to ignore, too precise to deny. The plane began its slow roll toward the runway. The cabin dimmed slightly as the windows filled with sunlight and tarmac blur. But the internal illumination had already shifted. For Lucille, this was not new. She had lived through eras where she'd been told to move, to wait, to smile through disrespect. But this moment where she hadn't had to speak, hadn't had to plead, meant something. Not because a captain acknowledged her humanity, but because someone in power had refused to play blind. Shawnee sat straighter now, her thoughts with Mira. Her daughter was growing up in a world that still needed lessons delivered over airplane intercoms. But at least today, someone had said what mattered. Out loud. The wheels left the ground. The cabin lifted, and the world below shrank into quilted squares of land and light. But the people on that plane carried more than carry-ons. They carried awareness. Not everyone was changed by it. But no one was untouched. Because sometimes a flight doesn't just lift off. Sometimes, it rises with something. Something heavier than luggage. Something more enduring than wind. It rises with truth. The plane had leveled off at cruising altitude. The mechanical hum beneath the floor softening into white noise. Overhead lights flickered once, then settled. Flight attendants moved like quiet dancers through the narrow aisles, checking belts, preparing beverage carts, asking coffee or water in practiced tones. But in row 3, the silence between seats wasn't routine. It was dense, pressed tight with what had gone unsaid. Clark Danner sat stiffly in 3C, staring blankly out the window. His tie had come slightly askew, and he hadn't noticed. His fingers tapped the armrest rhythmically, like he was rehearsing a defense for a courtroom that didn't exist. He'd told himself it wasn't his fault, told himself he hadn't meant anything by it. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew that not meaning it had never made it disappear. Lucille sat beside him in 3A, back still straight, her gaze resting far out the window. She hadn't moved or spoken since takeoff. Not to him, not to her son, not even to the flight attendant offering her sparkling water. Her presence alone was louder than words, a lighthouse beam of stillness that made it impossible to pretend nothing had happened. Between them, Nestled in 3B, Eloise stirred. The little girl had been mostly quiet since boarding. But now she looked up from her unicorn, her bright eyes moving between her father and the woman beside her. She wasn't upset anymore, just curious. Her voice when she finally spoke was soft, but clear enough to echo through every corner of her row. "Daddy, why are we mad at the nice grandma?" The sentence dropped like a stone into water. No splash, just deep ripples. Clark flinched, the muscles in his face twitching involuntarily. His lips parted, but nothing came out right away. He looked down at her, stunned, almost offended by her phrasing. He swallowed hard and glanced sideways at Lucille, who hadn't reacted, hadn't even blinked. "I'm not mad, sweetheart," he said, forced smile returning. It was a misunderstanding. That's all." Eloise frowned. "But you said she wouldn't move. You looked mad. I saw you." Clark turned fully toward his daughter, lowering his voice now. "It's more complicated than that." She blinked. "Why?" The simplicity of the question left no room to hide. Across the aisle, a woman in her late 40s with auburn curls and reading glasses looked over. She'd been quiet the whole time, watching with a book in her lap she hadn't turned a page in since boarding. Now she nodded slightly, her eyes locking with Clark's for a half second. She said nothing, but the expression spoke volumes. "She's right, you know." Shawnee heard it too from the row behind. She closed her eyes for a moment and exhaled. She'd been waiting for a break in the tension, a shift, and leave it to a child to be the only one brave or unburdened enough to ask what adults couldn't. Clark cleared his throat. "Look, honey, sometimes grown-ups just want things a certain way. That doesn't mean we're mad." Eloise tilted her head, thinking. But she was sitting there first. "I know. And she was being nice." "Yes, she was." "Then why were you mad?" Clark pressed his palm against his forehead. He looked exhausted, not physically, but philosophically, like he'd just been handed a mirror and couldn't look away. "Because," he said slowly, "I wanted you to sit with me. That's all. It had nothing to do with her." But Eloise didn't buy it. Children are strange that way. They can spot cracks in a story even before they know the words for the lies. "She didn't do anything bad," Eloise said more to herself now. Lucille turned her head slowly, not to Clark but to the child beside her. Her voice was soft, even warmer than she'd been all flight. "No, baby. I didn't." Clark tensed, but Eloise looked up at Lucille and smiled. "I like your necklace," she said. Lucille glanced down at the thin gold chain resting at her collarbone, then smiled back. "Thank you, sugar. It was a gift." "From who?" "My son." Shaq, sitting quietly in the aisle seat, finally moved, just enough to turn slightly toward the girl and offer her a small nod. She beamed. The woman across the aisle let out the breath she'd been holding for the past half hour. Clark shifted again, struggling to stay composed. The cabin was no longer with him. The passive audience had tipped. They weren't cheering for Lucille, exactly, but they weren't pretending she was invisible anymore. That made all the difference. And worse, his daughter, his own flesh and blood, wasn't on his side either. Not because she meant to rebel, but because she saw clearly. He leaned closer to Eloise, hoping to steer her attention back. "Let's just read, okay? Why don't you pick something from your bag?" But she was already talking to Lucille again. "Do you have grandkids?" Lucille chuckled lightly. "I do. A whole handful of them. Tall ones too." "Like him?" Eloise asked, pointing a thumb toward Shaq. Lucille smiled wider. "Especially like him." Eloise giggled. "He's really big. Is he a superhero?" Shaq raised an eyebrow, amused. He didn't answer, but Lucille did. "Something like that." Clark sunk back into his seat, resigned. He stared out the window as clouds drifted by, silent and slow. He could feel it happening, his own reflection taking form in the silence. Not the man he pictured himself to be, but the one who had emerged in the cabin today. He hadn't yelled, he hadn't cursed, but he'd revealed something. And now it couldn't be stuffed back inside polite language. Shawnee watched all this unfold with quiet scrutiny. Part of her wanted to lean forward, speak directly to Clark, ask him why he even had to think twice before treating someone like Lucille with respect. But another part of her understood, nothing she could say would do what Eloise already had. Sometimes the mirror has to come from your own blood to matter. Rena passed by, offering water now. She paused slightly at Lucille's row. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked gently. Lucille nodded. Ginger ale, please. Rena handed it to her, and for a moment, their eyes met again. Gratitude passed without words. The cart moved on. Eloise looked up at Lucille again. Do you want to color with me? Clark started to object, but Lucille's voice came first. I'd like that. As Eloise fished crayons out of her backpack, her father sat in silence. Around him, the plane was calm again. The tension had lifted, but not for him. Because it was one thing to be corrected by a stranger. It was another to be seen by your own child, and not know how to explain yourself. And that, more than anything else, is how a man begins to unravel. The hush in the cabin had grown familiar by now. Its own kind of passenger. It slipped between shoulders, draped over seatbacks and lingered in tray tables left untouched. For Clark Danner, the silence had evolved. At first it was annoying, then disarming. Now it was condemning. He no longer felt like a frustrated parent trying to secure comfort for his daughter. He felt exposed. Lucille O'Neal colored quietly with Eloise. A small borrowed packet of crayons laid neatly across the tray table. Their heads were close. Lucille wasn't trying to teach a lesson, and that's what made it hit harder. She was simply being kind, steady, warm. Everything Clark had convinced himself he was. He watched them from the same seat he'd occupied for the last hour. 3C. The very spot he had tried to own from the moment he boarded. But now the seat felt smaller, like it was shrinking with every passing second. And then Rena Caldwell returned. Her hands were folded, her steps calm, the signature flight attendant smile in place. But something beneath it had changed. She wasn't just performing service anymore. She was executing resolution. Mr. O'Neal, she said, eyes meeting Shaq's. A private suite has opened up in the executive cabin. We'd like to offer it to you and your family. The crew apologizes for the earlier disturbance and would like to thank you for your patience. Lucille looked up, surprised, but not startled. She tilted her head toward Rena, then toward her son. Shaq's face remained unreadable. He nodded once, then looked to his mother. Lucille nodded too. That was all it took. Shawnee, who had remained silent and sharp-eyed a row back, stood slowly. She gathered her bag and stepped forward. The suite wasn't just a reward. It was a statement. Clark looked up, blinking. Wait, what's happening? He asked, voice dry. Rena didn't even look at him. Lucille stood, gently patting Eloise's hand. You be good, sweetheart. Finish the sky blue, okay? Eloise nodded. Okay. Shaq reached for the overhead bin and retrieved Lucille's carry-on. His motions were smooth, respectful, silent thunder. He didn't so much as glance at Clark, but Rena did. We appreciate your understanding, she said to the cabin. Her words weren't sharp. They were neutral, but with edges. In situations where passengers demonstrate exceptional patience and cooperation, we do what we can to make their travel experience more comfortable. Clark swallowed hard. He wasn't the one being praised. He wasn't even being addressed. He was being excluded, by design. His daughter was watching. Passengers in rows 2 through 4 shifted slightly in their seats. Some looked away. Others offered quiet smiles to Lucille as she passed. One man, the same who had earlier stayed silent during Clark's worst moments, clapped softly twice before stopping himself. A ripple of polite applause followed, brief but sincere. Clark's face flushed. So that's it? She gets the seat, then an upgrade? Rena turned to him now, cool and unbothered. No, sir. She kept her seat. The upgrade is simply the airline's way of acknowledging the situation. Nothing was taken, only added. Shawnee turned back as she passed Clark, her expression unreadable but her voice low and even. Funny thing about seats, she said. They don't mean much unless you've earned the right to sit in them. And with that, she followed Lucille and Shaq toward the front of the cabin, the new suite tucked behind a curtain, and 2 sleek sliding doors. Privacy. Comfort. Recognition. Not for fame, but for grace. Clark sat back down heavily. Eloise leaned into him, confused. Why are they moving? Are we going to? No, he said, the words snapping more than he intended. We're staying here. But she was nice, Eloise whispered. I wanted her to help me with the rainbow. Clark said nothing. The curtain closed. The moment was over. But the weight of it remained. He looked down at the seat Lucille had just vacated. It was pristine, untouched but full. He had fought for it earlier with such arrogance, demanded that a woman give it up, not because he needed it, but because he could. Now looking at it again, he saw it differently. He saw the mirror it had become. This seat had never been just about position. It had become a reflection of who he was when he wasn't being watched, of who he wanted to be, but wasn't, of the space he demanded, but could never fill. The irony was sharp. He had pushed so hard to make Lucille feel out of place, and yet here he was now, the one no longer belonging, the one avoided by eye contact, denied applause, forgotten in the quiet justice of a cabin that had seen enough. Rena passed again with the beverage cart, her demeanor professional as ever. But when she stopped at row 3, she didn't ask him first. Ask the woman across the aisle. She served Clark last, and with no warmth. He could have said something, could have asked to speak to the captain, written a review, made a scene, but he didn't. Because deep down, he understood. This wasn't something that could be argued away. This wasn't about policy or customer satisfaction. This was about the consequence of being seen too clearly, too soon, because in the end he had gotten what he wanted. The seat was his, but it came with a mirror he hadn't asked for. And now all he could do was sit in it, surrounded by the truth. There was no turbulence, no crash, no shouting, just a man, seated firmly in the echo of his own undoing. The wheels hit the runway with a soft but final thud, followed by the rumble of slowing momentum. The cabin shifted slightly, as passengers leaned forward instinctively, the silence deepening as the hum of flight gave way to the familiar stillness of arrival. No one clapped. No one cheered. The atmosphere wasn't heavy with fatigue. It was filled with something more introspective, as if the altitude had revealed more than just landscapes through windows. Clark sat with his arms crossed, staring at the seat back in front of him. Eloise had fallen asleep again, her cheek against the unicorn, lips parted in innocent exhaustion. He didn't move to wake her just yet. He didn't speak. There was no spin left in him. Somewhere along the course of this 2-hour flight, his authority had unraveled like a poorly tied knot. Now all he could do was sit in the silence, waiting to disembark into a world that would feel different, not because it had changed, but because now he had been seen. The curtain at the front of the cabin swished open as the door unlocked and swung wide. Light poured in from the jet bridge. Passengers began to rise, stretching, reaching for bags, mumbling goodbyes and travel plans under their breath. But in row 3, everyone remained seated. Lucille stood first from the suite. Her steps were even, her shoulders high. She didn't glance back. She didn't need to. Her presence had already lingered long enough in the minds of the passengers, who'd watched her resist, not with fists, but with stillness. Her silence had told a story no intercom could carry. Shawnee followed behind, a calm pillar as always, sharp-eyed, composed, but carrying the quiet electricity of someone who never forgot. Her hand brushed Lucille's arm in passing. Just once. Just enough. And then came Shaq. He moved slowly, intentionally, not because of his size, but because every step seemed like a punctuation mark, measured, grounded, firm. When he reached the galley, Rena was waiting. Her posture proud but reserved. Her smile was soft, almost tired, like someone who had won a battle she never wanted to fight. Shaq extended a massive hand. "Thank you," he said quietly. Rena met his grip. "Thank her," she replied, nodding toward Lucille now making her way down the jet bridge. Shaq smiled. Not wide, not performative, just genuine. "I do. Every day." The exchange lasted barely 10 seconds. But everyone watching, those who had sat silent, those who had whispered judgment, those who had hidden behind their devices, felt it, like a closing argument, like a gavel, falling in invisible court. And then, just before turning to follow his mother, Shaq paused. He turned his head. Clark, still seated, tried not to react, but he looked up. Of course he did. Their eyes locked. Two men, both fathers, both raised in different Americas. Shaq didn't lean in. He didn't point, didn't glare, didn't grandstand. He just said it. "It's not about the seat." And then he walked away. No further commentary, no demand for understanding, no lecture, just that one sentence, dropped like a pebble into a pool of shame. Clark blinked hard. He tried to swallow but couldn't. He reached for his daughter's bag, pulling it closer, like grounding himself with motion would erase what had been said. But the words hung in the air. They wouldn't go. It wasn't about the seat. It never had been. In his mind, Clark scrambled for explanations he could give himself. How he'd just been trying to protect his daughter. How any father might have done the same. But the truth kept pushing through. He hadn't asked. He'd expected. He hadn't recognized. He had seen a black woman, in a first-class seat, and thought obstacle before equal. That was the problem. And now the man he'd feared confronting had told him, without a hint of aggression, exactly what the problem was, in front of everyone. And without needing to raise his voice, passengers filtered off the plane. Some passed Shaq with grateful nods. Some glanced down, ashamed. A woman in row 5 mouthed the words, "Thank you," as she passed Rena, and Rena only nodded in return, the weight of it all still tucked in her chest. As Clark finally stood, gently waking Eloise, he turned again toward the empty suite where Lucille had been seated. He saw the folded blanket, the untouched glass of water, and something he hadn't seen before, his own reflection in the small polished panel beside the aisle. It was subtle, faint, but clear enough. He didn't like what he saw. And memory, like a movie reel, pulled him into a flash of his own childhood, his mother pulling him closer when they walked past a black family at the park. Her muttered warnings about staying where we belong, the offhand comments at the dinner table, the jokes, the way she'd whispered when saying certain names. He had thought himself better than that. More aware, more modern. But that mirror didn't lie. And Shaq's voice, low, calm, unbothered, had shown it to him. Back inside the terminal, Shaq caught up with his mother and placed one arm protectively around her shoulder. She leaned into it slightly, a gesture of peace. He had honored her, without anger, without spectacle, just present. Lucille looked up at him and smiled. "You didn't have to say anything." "I know," Shaq replied, eyes forward, "but sometimes they need to hear it anyway." Lucille nodded. "Sometimes, yeah. But the ones who really hear it, they never needed the words." They walked on, past gates, past waiting lounges, past the noise of the world they'd never stopped having to teach. Back on the plane, the final cleaning crew entered. The suite was empty now, but the energy inside lingered. It always would. Because every now and then, the world needs to be reminded. You don't have to raise your voice to change the room. You just have to carry the truth like it's been carried before you. The Miami to New York flight had landed hours ago. The wheels had long kissed the runway. Passengers had disappeared into terminals, and the echo of luggage wheels had faded into the mechanical hum of cleaning crews and airport music. But what had taken off in that cabin had nothing to do with jet fuel. It had been slower, deeper, more human, and it hadn't landed yet. At gate C-19, the gate agent printed out fresh boarding passes for the next flight, her cheerful tone at odds with the lingering stillness left behind. But inside that Falcon Air aircraft, among the empty seats and folded tray tables, residue remained, invisible to most, but tangible to anyone who had witnessed it. Rena Caldwell sat in the galley, off duty now, sipping lukewarm tea from a paper cup. Her name tag had been removed, but the day hadn't slipped off so easily. She leaned her head back against the galley wall and let out a long breath, not of exhaustion, but release. She had done her job, and more. Not perfectly, not loudly, but with the grace required of someone who had long since learned how to fight without fists. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the note Shawnee had slipped her during deplaning. It was small, handwritten on hotel stationery, folded in half with precision. On the outside, one word, respect. Inside, the message was brief. "You didn't blink. Thank you for holding the line with us." There was no signature. None was needed. Rena read it once more, folded it again, and tucked it into her wallet, between her ID and her grandmother's church photo. She sat a little taller after that. Sometimes the best victories didn't come with trophies. They came in ink and silence. Elsewhere in the terminal, passengers from that flight had scattered, but some still carried the atmosphere like an unseen coat. In the bookstore near gate D6, the woman with auburn curls who had nodded at Eloise bought a copy of Between the World and Me. She hadn't planned to read anything that heavy on vacation, but something in her now demanded it. A man who had said nothing during the flight found himself hesitating before cutting in front of someone at the coffee line. He didn't know why, he just knew something had shifted in him. A mirror had been placed where his assumptions used to live. In the restroom, a mother softly explained to her child why some people get treated differently, struggling to find words that didn't excuse, but also didn't frighten. She didn't get it perfect, but she tried, and trying, in that moment, mattered. At baggage claim, Clark Danner stood by the carousel, one hand on the handle of Eloise's unicorn suitcase. He kept his eyes low. Lucille, Shaq, and Shawnee were nowhere nearby. He had waited until they were gone to retrieve his luggage. Not because he feared a confrontation, but because he couldn't bear the weight of another look. Not from them. Not from anyone who had seen the full arc of who he'd been on that plane. Eloise tugged on his jacket. "Can I call Mommy?" He nodded. "Yeah. In a minute." She looked up at him again, innocent eyes blinking. "Is the grandma gonna be okay?" He hesitated. Then, softer than he expected, "She's been okay for a long time." He didn't add that she had probably never been okay in the way his daughter understood it. But he was learning painfully and slowly that truth doesn't always come in teachable moments. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet reckoning. And when it does, you either face it or you run. Clark didn't run, but he didn't speak either. He simply carried the weight of a flight that hadn't ended. On the curb outside Terminal B, Shaq stood by a black SUV, loading Lucille's bag into the back seat. He moved carefully, not because the bag was heavy, but because he handled her things the way a man handles history, deliberately, with reverence. Lucille stood beside him, the late afternoon sun framing her like a statue carved from grace and memory. She watched people rush by, business travelers, students, families, and saw in them the echo of all the places she'd once been expected to disappear. Shawnee opened the car door, sliding into the front seat with a quiet sigh. She looked back at Lucille and offered a tired smile. "You ready to go home?" she asked. Lucille looked around once more. "Home isn't where we live," she said. "It's wherever they can't tell us to move." Shaq nodded slowly, closing the trunk. "Then we'll keep building it," he said. As he rounded the car, a man passed by, phone pressed to his ear, mid-conversation. He did a double take, recognizing Shaq, eyes widening. He opened his mouth to speak, but stopped. Something in the look between mother and son, in the stillness of that moment, told him this wasn't the time. Instead, he nodded once and kept walking. Inside the cockpit of the now empty plane, Captain Roland Beach made one final note in his log before removing his headset. He was a man of routine, veteran pilot, not prone to grand gestures, but before leaving the flight deck, he opened a worn leather journal he kept tucked in his carry-on. He flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "Flight 47-2. Nothing mechanical. Cabin event. No turbulence, except the kind you don't measure with instruments." He paused. Passenger Lucille O'Neal. She didn't move. And thank God. He closed the book. Outside, planes lifted into sky after sky, following invisible tracks into places known and unknown. But for those who had been aboard that flight, those who had watched and listened, and changed what had taken off wouldn't be landing anytime soon. Because sometimes, what gets airborne is more than a machine. Sometimes it's a truth we forgot to carry with us, until someone refused to put it down. And sometimes, when dignity doesn't budge, the whole world moves around it. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it land quietly. Carry the silence, the stare, the sentence, and let it shape how you see the world. Next time you're in a seat of comfort, ask yourself, who had to move for you to be there? Truth travels fast, but change only boards when you make space for it. The next flight starts with you.